Alrighty, good evening everybody once again. Happy Friday to all of you. My name is Scott, I'm a technical artist with Studio 369, and today we're back again taking a look at Noble Legacy. And today we're going to be doing a behind the scenes, which the focus of today's is TSR, or Temporal Super Resolution. It's a upscaling technology that's in Unreal Engine. It's based off of temporal anti-aliasing upscaling back in Unreal Engine 4, but it has a couple of quirks to it in order to make it work the way that you really want it to, but it has the benefit of giving you tons of performance, and it's something that we utilize greatly in Noble Legacy in order to have our environments look as beautiful as possible while being as performant as possible. Something that is a kind of a main requirement of my job to focus on. So let's kind of just dive right into it. So today's might be a little bit shorter than usual, but it's also a complicated topic, so we'll go to the length of whatever it takes, but let's go into it regardless. So what is temporal super resolution? So we can go to Epic's site which has all the documentation on there for Unreal Engine. It's a really great site if you're a developer yourself and you're just wanting to learn really anything on Unreal Engine. If there's something that you don't quite understand, there's tons of information on here. I mean, on this page alone for all about TSR, between, you know, the scalability of how it works to console variables for controlling it to, and everything else in between, all of that is included on here. So it can be quite dense sometimes, you know, very, very dense, but it's an incredibly useful resource for developers and anybody who's really just curious about it alike. So I said already that temporal super resolution, it's an advanced upscaling and anti-aliasing technology, and it's designed to improve performance and image quality. And it does this by reconstructing a high-resolution image from a lower-resolution image rendered using temporal data from multiple frames, usually the present frame and then a couple of previous frames. What that means exactly, we'll take a look here at this example that they give on the Unreal documentation website, is that this is using their, I think this is the city that came with the Matrix demo that they released a couple of years ago. And you can see we have an image here that's rendered at native at 4K resolution, native meaning at its normal resolution. There's no upscaling going on itself. And yes, it looks clean, but they're showing over here all of the diagnostic tools for showing frame time, game time, draw time, all of the all the frame times for the different parts of the processes that it takes to render out a frame, and showing you that the cost is quite high, especially on the frame and GPU. So what these mean over here, these diagnostics tools, is the frame is you can think of that as the total time. So this is how much time that frame in total took to draw. And then underneath it is all the different parts of said frame that basically add up to it for the most part. I'm being really general with this, but that's generally the case. So we can see on the game and draw thread, which those both rely on the CPU for different parts of one is for the kind of logic of, say, CPUs, pathfinding, or CPUs, like computer controlled agents, and then other like game logic stuff like calculating scores and other stuff like that. That'll be all on the game thread, which is CPU. And the draw thread is also going to be on the CPU thread, where it's going to say, it's going to look at all the objects that are currently in the frustum of the camera that's being looked at it, and it's going to go, hey, what needs to be drawn here? Is anything obscuring me that I don't need to be drawn? And so that is all of the draw frames, or that's the draw thread. If you ever heard of draw calls, it's kind of where that falls in line. Now, moving on down from there, we have the GPU, which we can see this is the big problem in this scene. GPU is all about, well, how much processing the GPU is going to have to do, because your CPU is going to tell what things to be drawn, but the GPU is going to be the powerhouse and actually draw the things. So we can see here that at 57 milliseconds, that's quite slow. If you're aiming for 60 frames per second as the standard, if not lower for higher resolution or higher refresh rate monitors, then you need at least 16 milliseconds, 16.6 milliseconds or lower. So having it at 57, where it's pretty slow here. So, and what they're going to show you here on the other side of this kind of wipe here, we have 4K frames rendered at 1080p resolution, and that we have much better frame times. And this is by using TSR. So what TSR is going to be doing here is that, in essence, it's going to be displaying the game internally at 1080p. So 1080p is 1/4 the resolution of 4K. So when you have a quarter of the pixels to render, and then it's going to use the certain cores on your GPU to kind of upscale it to 4K, it's logical that, yes, you're only rendering 1/4 of the frames and doing a little bit of additional rendering by doing this TSR, then that is going to be a lower cost than rendering out natively entirely. And we can see here we've gone from, what was it, 57 before? Whoops. Yeah, 57 down to 33. So a much needed improvement, and the image quality, at least from this static shot, is more or less the same. Now, we'll get into the drawbacks of TSR here, but we can see in general all of the static objects, the big billboards and buildings, more or less look the same, which is quite impressive. But if we look a little closer at some moving objects, say like this car here, there's a little bit of a blur trail behind it. That's one of the artifacts and kind of downsides of using such an upscaling technology. We'll talk about that. So so in general, this is a more or less ideal scenario, and where we've nearly doubled our frame rate, or more or less cut our frame time it takes to draw the scene in half, and we have a very similar looking image. So this is the main way of how the benefit of Epic trying to push TSR and how it can achieve great looks at a lower cost. And we use this the same way in our system, and it does bring great performance, but there are a lot of things that you have to be careful around when designing things that, again, we will get into in a second. So how does this work generally? It's like, how does something like this just, how does it just take frames and then use that to reconstruct details at a higher resolution later on down the line? Well, it's part of all of these temporal upscalers in general. So with temporal upscalers, like it says here, I'll kind of zoom it in for you. They use data from the current and previous frames to produce a high quality upscaled result. temporal upscalers all work the same with Unreal Engine, whether they're Unreal 4's temporal anti-aliasing upscaling or Unreal 5's temporal super resolution, or third party such as DLSS or AMD's FSR. They all plug into the post-processing chain in the same location between depth of field and motion blur. So that's what this chart is showing here. So this is the basically the order of events that play out when it's drawing the post-processing frame for when you're drawing a frame from start to finish. So let's get started with the view geometry, then depth of field, then it's TSR, then motion blur, bloom, tone mapper, UI, and the back buffer resolution. So what does that exactly mean? Well, there's, as we kind of just discussed here, there's a order of events at which parts of the frame are drawn, and this is kind of getting into, you know, graphics rendering in general, and how, you know, all the different G buffers and other very technical details of how frames are drawn and presented to you. But the essential is that, like in math or whatever, there's an order of operations that things are done in, and that does not change. So when we're adding in this technology, when you put it into the chain, there's going to be, you know, some downsides to that. And I think it's important to start looking into why. So with this temporalness, you know, this time-based information from prior frames to reconstruct details in the current frame, this approach allows Unreal 5 to render scenes at a lower resolution and then upscale them without quality loss. But I said before, what about, you know, moving objects here? Because when we go and look back at that, kind of at the car here where it's using temporal here, this might be a little bit hard with stream compression, but there's definitely a ghosting or a blur here. And this is something that Unreal, Epic, they're not trying to hide it around this necessarily. We can see there's less ghosting artifacts against high frequency backgrounds than was visible with Unreal 4's anti-aliasing method. So there's less, but that doesn't mean that there's not any at all. And there's ways to be able to help reduce this, but it's never going to be going away entirely, at least for right now, until we get a second or a third version of this technology to improve that. The other benefits of TSR, it's extremely scalable and it works well across many different platforms, anything that supports shader model 5 or higher. So basically any major console besides, or any powerful console besides like the Nintendo Switch and PC. So it even works on Mac too. If you are one of the like 0.1% of people who plays on Macs, that might even be too generous. So what does this have to do with our game necessarily? Well, let's kind of jump into it here. So we're going to be back in our showcase map over here where we have our kind of a snowy environment now for our winter. So you can see all the season changes stuff. It actually looks really pretty good with all the kind of frost covered leaves and all that. Really nice detail. Yeah, nice little snowy environment here. And people still wearing 3/4 length pants. But anyway, so this is what you would normally see within Unreal's standard viewport, and more or less what you would see in game here. But as a developer, there's going to be different view modes that we need to see in order to do our jobs more effectively. So one of the things here will just be like, well, how do we even tell that FSR is working in this, or yeah, no, TSR. How do we even know if it's working in the scene here? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can check that, but one of them is in stat GPU. So there are all these console variables here in where we can see here. Let me pull up the rest of the console variables. So let's do stat unit, stat, give it 1 second. There we go. Didn't have to press it again. So stat FPS, then stat RHI, Okay, so you're going to see just kind of a bunch of numbers here, and you're going to be like, what the heck are all of these things? Well, there's a couple of things here. So one of which is we have the same kind of frame numbers that we have over here. So we can see our FPS, we can see our frame times, which is going to be basically the same as our FPS, but all developers are going to be using frame times over FPS because of certain situations here where frame times is always absolute versus FPS can be a little bit misleading. So one example I can say is, let's say like the difference between 30 FPS. Let's say we're talking about, oh, we're losing about 5 frames a second if we're losing, or if we're using this system or this nice shader or whatever. 5 frames at 30 frames going down to 25 is a big hit versus losing 5 frames and you're running at 200 FPS. That's the difference there. Versus we can say, well, instead of using frames, let's use milliseconds, and where we can say 0.2 milliseconds. That is scalable across any amount of frames, which is that's why we use milliseconds instead. It's the total number of frames that when you do the comparison of saying 5 frames, there can be a difference between having a lot and having a little bit. It matters a lot. There's a heavier weight to it. So we need to take a look at the scene as a whole. So what we're seeing over here with all of these, with the stat GPU, stat RHI, these are all console commands that allow you to see the how much certain processes are costing within your scene. So because we're talking about GPU here, because that's what the TSR falls under, we can take a look over here at the top control group here. So we have our base pass, which is a just kind of the scene and the geometry itself. We have shadows, render velocities, and then the fourth thing down from there is DLSS. Now I mentioned earlier about TSR, and TSR is mainly the focus, but DLSS is a very similar technology that does the same thing as TSR and can kind of work in tandem with it. So when we're talking about TSR here, we're really talking mostly about DLSS, but they basically mean the same thing. They're both an upscaling technology that uses temporal information from previous frames and the current frame to draw on objects in the background. So if we keep on going down here, so all these numbers are what developers are going to be looking at behind the scenes. So what you as a player care about in the end is that this number here is as high as possible. So obviously we're running in the editor here, so it's not going to be as high as if it was in a shipped build, but to be able to run at 80 frames per second in editor, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. So we'll go ahead and hide some of these. So that's one way we can tell that it's working. We can see it listed in our kind of our stat groups that allow us to just see information behind the scenes. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is our visualization view modes. Try saying that 2 times fast. So over here in the top left, there are a couple of different buttons here. These are all basically talking about the camera. So it's either what perspective our camera is going to have, or this is the lit scene, but it's like, can we see it without any directional lights in the scene? It's just fully unlit. Or can we see in a wireframe, or just detailed lighting? All these different ways to get a better idea if we're trying to look for a specific part of our pipeline. Then we have show, which with show here is our, oh, do we lose frames here? Nope, we're still good. Okay. Everything kind of froze on the right side of my screen here where I see my output views. All right. So what we want to take a look at here today is under the show tab here, which is we're going to see more of our visualization view modes here. So it's under the visualize section here. And we're going to go down here and click temporal super resolution and temporal upscaler. So now you're going to see a bunch of these other windows pop up here. And these windows are used to for a couple of things here. So one of which you'll see these different kind of colors and patterns and all these, and these are all showing a different kind of a view mode of to see if what we're using is working the way that we wanted it to. So one of the ways that TSR works is that it heavily relies on motion vectors, which track how objects and pixels move between frames. So a vector, a point in space with a direction and an intensity, that's a vector in general. So these vectors more or less guide TSR in aligning details from previous frames to the current frame, and then which is to help reduce artifacts while maintaining sharpness. So so with that, that's why we have in one of our view modes here this visualize motion blur. So I'm going to go ahead, I think I can pull it up on the whole screen here by doing this one. Yeah, basically. So we're going to see that there are a couple objects here that are in gray, and then a couple of them that are kind of in yellow. And the difference between that is what has motion blur enabled and what has it disabled, because if it's just going to be a static object like over here on a building, it's not going to move. So we don't really care if we have motion blur applied to this object here. So it's just better to leave it grayed out, which helps performance. We don't need to calculate its motion blur. We don't care. But on all the foliage that kind of waves a little bit, we do care, because between frames, its position in space and its position of how it's facing the camera are changing. So that's why all of this is in yellow, and it's the same thing with all of our characters that we also care, because they're going to be moving and walking around. We want them to have as clean of an outline as possible, so we need to have them expose their motion blur information. This is done every frame. So you can even see if I move around the camera, you're going to see that vector information of how the frame is changing. So if I just go up and down, you'll see they're going to be the dot, and it's pointing the opposite direction. So it's saying this point in space from the previous frame, how much changed and how fast did that change, essentially the intensity. Because again, a vector is a direction and an intensity. So with that, if we had something, kind of walking across the scene, we'll kind of see those pixels kind of move along with it, basically grabbing the character. So if I go ahead and just kind of shift, I'm going to move the camera a little bit more slowly here. So see, you'll kind of see the yellow ones wiggle, but especially on our main characters here, like this guy here, we can see the directional arrows picking up his position, or rather the camera's perspective to the individual changing as I kind of pan left and right here. So we can see it's showing that whether I'm moving the camera to the right or to the left, or that person is moving in space based on the pixels. And we can see in this view over here, this visualized reprojection, the individual object itself, because that's all we care about. We don't care about the other objects out here. So that's an important thing. And then down in the bottom left here, it's probably going to be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but it's a summary of a couple of different things of information. But one of them is this input and output here. So these are resolutions. And what we said earlier is that it's an upscaling technology. So internally, it's going to have a lower resolution than what is going to be displayed to you in the final image. So if you've ever played a recent game and where you see, like, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, for example, and you'll see like, oh, do you want DLSS on? And then you'll see that like quality, performance, ultra performance, or something in between, balanced. All of that is basically picking relative to your monitor that you're using, what do you want the internal resolution to be? So the higher quality, it's going to be a higher internal resolution, so it's going to do less upscaling. So it's not going to do as much process in there, so therefore you'll tend to see less of the artifacts that can be produced from TSR or DLSS. I might say them both interchangeably, but they're more or less kind of the same. this is a little bit more of a DLSS focus, but the idea is overall very similar. So looking into this further, like I said, DLSS plus TSR is not perfect, so there's a lot of different issues here. So if we take a look at this number down here, I'll just read it out because it might be hard to see. So right now our input is 1636 by 1046, and our output, which is basically this square window here, so that's why these resolutions are going to be a little bit non-standard for like a 16 by 9. This is 3056 by 1953. So I'm on a 4K monitor here. So normally that's 3840 by 2160. And FSR works on scaling. So if I go over here, we can see that there is a current screen percentage. And what this percentage means is basically how much of the image are going to be taking a look at as a whole to upscale from. What is going to be our internal image. And there's reasons to have that higher or lower than one another, and one of which is basically how much data you have to go through if you're trying to upscale a higher resolution image. So again, 4K 3840 by 2160 at 60 frames a second, if that is the minimum standard that we're aiming for, at least for my monitor. I know a lot of people are not going to be playing at 4K, probably going to be mostly at 1080p, some at 1440, but the examples still carry over. When you get 4K, that's a lot more data that we're going to have to present in the final image, which means even when we downscale it through our internal image to then upscale it, there's going to be a number of megapixels that are per second that are going to be fed into TSR/DLSS. So for a 50% screen percentage, so we're going to be taking a 4K image, only looking at half the pixels, in terms of resolution, and then for 60 frames per second. So if we're going to be doing the math there, it'd be 3840 by 2160 multiplied by 50 divided by 100, because screen percentage, squared times 60, which is going to be about, I think I wrote down the number here somewhere, 124.4 megapixels a second. So and then the higher we do that screen resolution, the higher that number is going to be. So it's a lot of data that's going to have to be processed. So that's why, even though we're technically doing a lower resolution image for our input, there is a cost to it, which is also why, when you have native scaling resolutions, they're going to be really expensive, because again, it's a lot of data you're going to have to push. That's millions of pixels that you're going to have to be pushing on your screen on the low end. That's for 1080p resolutions, and that's so much higher at 4K. It's 4 times as much. So with all that, so this screen percentage is going to be important for determining your kind of the look of your final image and how much performance you can really gain. So let me turn off all of these visualization view modes here, and we can kind of just, we put this at a static image here. Okay. We'll make sure that our frames are visible over here. So right now we're at I'm going to override the screen percentage. It usually defaults in around 50, 54. So I'm going to take this. Let's go to native. Let's go to basically 4K, even though this isn't quite 4K. And we can see that we're down to 60 FPS, more or less, in editor. So again, not bad. And the results of that are, we're now running native voice. So there's basically no upscaling that is happening. And so everything should be pretty crisp, especially from the trees in the background to anything that's kind of waving. It should look really, really crisp. And if we go to our GPU stats, let's see, DLSS is still going to be at 0.7. That's just because it's going to be doing its the interpolation. So that's about expected. So, and then if we go back to say, let's go to 75, go somewhere in the middle. So you can see objects in the background got a little bit blurrier, but it's still relatively close to native looking. It's just a little bit softer in the background. That's because instead of having, say, again, we have to think about the image as a whole. If this is like 3000 by 2000, what was it? About 3000 by 2000. So instead of having about 3000 by 2000, it has 25% less pixels to work with in this area. So let's say if this area in itself was like, I don't know, like a couple 100,000 pixels or something like that, and we cut that by 25%. So now this area has less to work with. So smaller objects in the far distance tend to suffer the most because, again, when we think about aliasing, it is to draw in a straight line, or to make a straight line out of what is usually jagged edges there to alias. And again, that's usually because there's only so many pixels on a screen that can be represented. And so when something is further away, there's less pixels to draw that thing with than if it were up close. And so you're going to see some really jagged stuff, especially on lower resolution monitors. So it's just something to keep in mind with this. And again, if we go back down to 50, which I think is about the standard, you see it's even a fair bit softer here, but again, not too bad of a result here. I'm mostly looking at the kind of this tree back here with all the kind of fringe areas here. It's going to be a little bit more blurred, but we just gain like 20 to 30 FPS over doing that. So it has its merits for sure. It's really important to keep all of this in mind here. So yes, the the performance of this cannot really be understated. It does add a lot, but with everything, there is a balance to having all of these methods in here. You can't just crank everything all the way up. You have to be careful. It's like Uncle Ben from the original Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And while this is a powerful tool, if used too much, you'll be able to start noticing some artifacts and some issues. So one of those things is, I'll kind of maybe break the illusion here. So if again, this might be, this is probably gonna be really hard to tell on stream compression, but basically, one of the things that this is using, again, is motion blur, or the motion vectors of objects and scenes. So if it's going to see an object moving, it's going to take the object's previous frames, like 2 or 3 of them, and then the current one to try and alias out a clean edge to then tell to present to you the cleanest image possible. Well, what if something's moving really fast? So if you have one frame here, and another one's there, it's not much it's going to really do. So it's going to try and interpolate that motion between those frames, and then you're going to get what's known as ghosting artifacts. So you have your true frames, showing the object at a certain speed, but then the in between, you're going to see what kind of looks like it's dark, and then it gets brighter for a little bit of time. So let's see if I can show that here. So let's see if I can play the scene here and get this to load. And then let's go ahead and I'll try and show the downsides of it that is hard to balance. And this is something that all developers are struggling to help deal with here, because it's hard to what's the word I want to say? It's hard to undermine the results that you can get from using this, but it's a double-edged sword in some ways. And this was something that we struggled with a long time with trying to get the balance for. And there's always, more you can do. So let's see if I can show you here. I guess we're going back to a regular snowy environment. Let's see here. Oh, I think I know what I can do. Door. Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is kind of a unique scenario here. So if you take a look at the, I'll go ahead and hide my camera. I don't know how much of that helped, but if you take a look at the stone behind on the floor between in this door here, if I opened up the door, you're going to see some lines from the artifacts moving. So that's just going to be an artifact of this. So the door is moving at such a speed that it's leaving after images behind it there. So there, and you'll probably even see, you'll see a fair bit of smearing from the character as well. So again, this is something that's difficult to hide. Like you'll see, it actually looks pretty good on this object up front, and part of that's going to come from objects that are in the further distance away from camera is going to be more noticeable because again, less pixels to draw back there. But as I come inside, you'll see that smearing tends to kind of go away and it doesn't look as bad. So there's always something to improve, but it's one of the main things that you have to keep in mind with this technology and use it carefully. So that's just kind of one example, and one of the other things is just trying to get the bloody thing to work correctly, because in Unreal there's a lot of different ways to render out a pixel in the end. There's even other ways that you can do aliasing, which is part of the process that TSR is going to be doing. But there's also going to be other aspects of it, which one of them is aliasing, just to have clean lines and edges in there. So if I go into the render settings in here, we can see if you were trying to set this for your own project, that there's this temporal super resolution under the anti-aliasing method. And there's a couple of other ones there. We have FXAA, TAA, which is kind of the older system from Unreal 4. So this basically does the temporal anti-aliasing but doesn't do the upscaling. And then multi-sample anti-aliasing, another older technology, which it basically samples multiple frames and then it averages them together to then get a clean line. Versus FXA is probably the cheapest anti-aliasing method, which is fast approximate, which basically just blurs everything. So it blurs all the pixels together, and that's how you would get an image there. So there's a whole bunch of rendering settings they have to consider in here, and that's not even considering using third-party plugins such as DLSS, which is pretty much a mainstay nowadays because again of the pixels and stuff, or the performance that it can provide. But you can see that the overall results are generally worth going for here. So that's more or less TSR / DLSS in a nutshell. So it's a bunch of aliasing and upscaling to then keep in balance and to make sure that everything is working properly. Oh, fun story. There was a time of when we were trying to get this, let me open up that motion blur perspective again. We were trying to get all the characters to basically have this yellow outline, and we were having this weird issue where it was recognizing the motion blur for basically the whole character's body, you know, like shirt, skin, face, clothes, all of that, and the hair when the character was moving. But then there were times when the character would stop moving, but then kind of like, you know, if they're like walking, you know, the character's walking and then they kind of, you know, stop and then they kind of do like an idle kind of pose or whatever and kind of look around. It would basically have all the motion blur everywhere except for the character's hair. It drove me nuts for like a couple of weeks just trying to figure out what's going on here, because there's a lot of different there's a lot of things that could go there. It's like, okay, why isn't this reporting its motion vector output? You can force that in the materials for a lot of these objects. Basically say, I need you to output your motion blur or your motion vector settings because it's an important use for this. And that's what we were doing for all the plants, and what we thought we were also doing it for the people as well. And it seemed to be working just fine for the plants, but it would be different for the hair for whatever reason. It turned out that remember earlier with let me see if I can find it. Where's that chart? So remember how there's this where this is inputted into the post-process pipeline? Well, there's different options within Unreal to basically say when is the depth or when is the velocity calculated within this, because again, motion vector is one of those things. So we need to determine when is it going to be doing that velocity pass right here. So when to write the velocity pass, which changing the settings before I was in editor restart. By default, in all the settings that I could find online that you should do, it should be right during the base pass. And this is with, you know, versions of Unreal from like 5.2 to 5.4 that I can find information for. Everyone says put it to right during base pass, it fixes everything. Well, everything was working except for the hair. The hair would still not work. But for whatever reason, setting it back to the depth pass did end up fixing it. So it's just, sometimes it's one of those things in programming where you can look everywhere and look really in the fine details of certain areas, and then all you needed to really do and change to fix the issue is one setting somewhere and just finding it. So it's, you know, it can sometimes drive you kind of batty, but that's kind of game development sometimes in general. It's you look at really close and you kind of go off into the weeds, and then the answer was kind of just right in front of you the whole time. So it's it is what it is sometimes. But was there anything else that we needed to discuss here with the TSR or DLSS? Let me take a look here. I will load it up in our build, and then we'll go through it with that. So let me open up the build there and go to that in 1 second here. So find it. Otherwise, getting probably pretty close to the end here, about 18 minutes away from an hour. So let's see if we can make it to there in the end. Check all my messages here quick. I think we're all doing good. Where's my key? Do you promised me yesterday? We are working out on keys right now. We'll be posting about it in the Discord relatively soon. I can't say exactly when, because that's where the community managers and people above me are deciding that, but it is being discussed on. Don't worry about it. Is this game going to have a deep storyline? How long do you estimate the story to be? Right now, as far as I know, there isn't a story per se. Like, there are interactions between you and Edward. If you determine that a story or not, that's up to you. But our main focus, especially for early access, is all of the building mechanics that you can have, like all the the toys and kind of the Lego pieces, and then a couple of have some scenarios. So like the Greenwood farm scenario for you to be able to build your character or build up the town in. So to be able to deal with the the aspects of the villagers, between handling the economy and the specific needs of your villagers to recruit them. That's what we're mainly focusing on for our early access right now. Go ahead and take a look here. So get this build just a little bit. I think this build got updated last night, so it might take a minute or two or a couple minutes for it to update. Meaning I have everything downloaded there, but it's just kind of compile things in the background in order to reopen it up. It might be due to comparing my save files in the previous build to this one. So give it a little bit here to adjust. Let's see how we're doing. Get a couple of viewers on YouTube, a couple on Twitch. So again, welcome. Again, we are on Kick, Twitch, and YouTube, so you can catch the stream at either of them. And then we're always posting more plus from our social media and other information that we do release in our Discord channel. So keep an eye out there. And then we're also on, or we'll soon be on Steam, excuse me. Believe we're still going through the review process with Steam, but if we go to our website here, which again is noblelegacygame.com, you can find all of our socials over here in the top right, and then on the way down we can see wishlist coming March 24th. So keep that date in mind, and we'll have the Steam page up there. I've seen an early build of the, like an early beta page of the Steam page, so it is in the works. So keep an eye out for that soon. And we'll give this build just a couple more minutes here. It might take another, oh, there we go, as I was speaking of the devil. All right, so let's go ahead, and I'm just gonna do the same thing right now for an early build. I'm just gonna go ahead and create a character and then back out to the sandbox mode here quick, because that's where I can show the all the settings in there for when you're trying to dial in it for your machine specifically. All right, let's get the cutscene, head back into the main menu, and then we'll go to the sandbox mode. All right, here we are. So we'll go ahead and hide the music over there. All right. So in the normal area here, if you hit escape and go to our options menu, this is where you'll see a lot of the settings here. So these are the ones that I'm currently using. So right now we're on Epic on all of the, basically on the high settings possible for all of the typical graphic settings. I always turn off motion blur personally, but that is up to you if you like that or not. And then over here we do have our DLSS, and our upscaling mode. So we do have both FSR and DLSS supported. And then under our DLSS settings, this is where I was talking about earlier between, DLAA, quality, balance, performance, and ultra performance. So right now I have it on just the anti-aliasing. So basically it's not really doing any upscaling per se. It's just using the anti-aliasing. So it's going to be as fairly close to native as possible. So again, I think I can pull up the stats on here. So I'm going to be pretty close to a native resolution here. We're getting about 50 or so, and I'm also streaming this. That's going to be taking a little bit away of performance on my end. So at 4K, basically max settings, that's not bad. It's not bad. I'll even see turn off frame generation. Yeah, so even with frame gen off, we're at 60 FPS. So pretty good. And then we're going to go into adjusting it. So before we get into that, so we can see all of the the kind of crisp foliage there, all at native resolution there. So everything looks pretty good, pretty crisp. You can kind of see the individual blades of grass. Everything is pretty clean. So then going into our options, should put the music back on, and then we'll leave frame generation off, but then we'll put the upscaling, we'll even put it to balanced. So kind of a middle ground here, and see we're up to about 90, somewhere in the 90s on average. And you can see, it more or less looks the same, at least on my end. Again, all this is going to be really hard to say on stream compression, but it's pretty clean for the most part, you know, even for a balance. So it's basically going to be like 50% screen percentage. So everything looks, you know, pretty good. There's not too much smearing. You know, images are still crisp. I can still see most blades of grass. It gets a little harder to see the further you are away, because again, less pixels being internally rendered, so objects in the distance are going to have less to be upscaled from. But all generally looks pretty good. The hair and everything still looks pretty crisp. So yeah, pretty clean overall. And the performance, you know, is pretty good for 4K. We're basically in the 90s. It's not bad, especially for the environment that we're having out over here. And a lot of this took a lot of tuning on our end to get to be as smooth as possible. And even, let's even scale it down to the lowest ultra performance, which I don't think we'll get that much more of a performance improvement. Yeah, not really. It's more or less the same, and everything just kind of looks really fuzzy and soft in the background. So we do have that scalability for you if you want. So, but I'm going to go ahead and bring that back up to the DLAA. Yeah, that looks really nice. But I'll leave the upscaling on, then we'll put it to quality. So this is just a little bit of upscaling relative. What the internal number is, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's very, very little. And again, everything looks pretty clean. And then if you have a later generation GPU, you can use frame generation if you want to get more frames. I don't think the FPS counter shows that exactly with Unreal's ones because it's a third-party plugin, but we'd have to double check. But this is smoother. But again, when you have the frame generation, that's a whole other, you know, bag of worms we're talking about with TSR doing upscaling and looking at the previous frames, and then now you're having generated frames. So not for for what people will say quote unquote fake frames. It does lead to tend to have more artifacts, and it does have an increase in input delay, and some people are going to be more sensitive to that. But again, all the controls are exposed for you to be able to tune it the way that you like it. So if you want to have as, you know, true of an experience, you can go and say, no, I just want the anti-aliasing, I don't want any upscaling, and I don't want any frame gen. Then perfect, you can have all that, and you can have the, you know, native 4K 60 experience. So, and you should have a, you know, a smoother experience on lesser hardware as well. So I don't know what the exact like minimum and recommended specs we're going to have released yet. Again, I'd have to take a look back at the Steam page, but yeah, overall very, very crisp. And you know, this is a big part of the graphics pipeline at the end, you know, understanding all of the different aspects. And you know, I think it's kind of fun and it's pretty cool, but it can get into the weeds and be pretty complicated. So otherwise, I kind of think that might be close to it for today. I know it'll be a little bit short, but don't really know what else to address for today. You know, we talked about TSR, we talked about DLSS and the pipelines that go into all of them, our implementation of it in our build of the game, and then comparing it, showing the pros and cons of handling all that and how to really balance it out as a developer. So I think we covered through quite a bit today in a relatively dense amount of time. I hope it was at least interesting for all of you that are watching. You know, I think it's cool, but you know, it's ultimately up to all of you, and I totally understand that. So I think kind of without further ado, I'll take a look at the messages one last time here to see if I've missed anything new. Don't think so. I think everything looks about the same as what I saw it last time. So, what time is it going? It's going on about 5 o'clock, so it's getting near end of day here. So, I think we're going to be calling it good there. So, again, thank you all for watching so much. We greatly appreciate your interest in our game, especially seeing all the messages in the Discord server. It's cool to see your excitement for all of it for Noble Legacy. Again, we're going to be having our Steam page coming up soon on March 24th on our website here. Again, you can follow all of our socials, and then we also are in the our Discord server here. So go ahead and you can take a look in there. We're always posting about some some polls, and then always on our news feeds for all of our different posts that we're talking about here. So always make sure that you're keeping an eye out for that. And I think without further ado, I'll see y'all next time. Take care.